The county of Norfolk has a plethora of beautiful medieval churches, having the most churches of any other county in Britain, numbering over 1,000 medieval churches and chapels spread across the idyllic countryside. Indeed, one could learn the story of Norfolk from studying the wide variety of Christian shrines around the county, and that is what I'll be doing today. I'll be taking you on an adventure, showing some of the most stunning ruined churches of Norfolk, each one providing a glimpse into the county's past, adding to its rich history as a realm of splendour and extravagance. This will serve as the first of multiple videos on this series, as Norfolk simply has too many church ruins to include in a single video. This video will highlight Norfolk's history through church ruins, and future videos will highlight each area of Norfolk through which ruined churches survive today as relics of a bygone age. We first begin with Appleton St Mary, which gives us a hint to the following of Christianity prior to the Norman invasion of Britain, and before the various cathedral building projects which helped Christianity surge forward in importance. Flirting along the outskirts of the royal Sandringham estate, Appleton Church stands proud on a high point of the cascading fields and woodlands. Appleton was once part of a medieval village which has all but disappeared, a story told over and over again when reflecting on the heyday of medieval Norfolk. The squat round tower is thought to be pre-conquest, possibly from around 1000 AD, however the nave is considered to be much later, perhaps replacing a redesigned Norman nave from the 12th century. Regardless, there is something rather romantic about the small stone arches standing in the open field. North Elmham will have its own dedicated video in the future, but it is definitely worth a mention due to being a church ruin in Norfolk which had a unique change of use after the Norman invasion. North Elmham was originally a Saxon Minster, the northern brother of its Suffolk counterpart, the aptly named South Elmham. Both North and South Elmham featured a rectangular ditch, a typical characteristic of a 10th century Saxon religious site. However, it is thought that this ditch, or at least the extension of which, is part of the later 14th century manor house that the church had been adapted into. After the Norman invasion of 1066, the religious order of Christianity was shaken up, with certain pre-existing religious sites such as Bury St Edmunds, York and Norwich receiving special favours, yet leaving some other locations behind. North Elmham was one of those locations which were left behind. The original Saxon church was built of wood and was dismantled by the Normans, replaced with a stone manor reserved for the Bishop of Norwich, Herbert de Losingham. These are the majority of the ruins that you see here today. It is not entirely clear, but there is substantial evidence for a Norman Motte and Bailey castle on this site, either before or after the construction of the Bishop's Manor. For a deeper dive into this unique ruin, be sure to keep an eye out for a future video about this site. Godwick was a medieval rural village in the heart of Norfolk. It was never a large settlement, containing perhaps 20 to 30 houses at its peak, but by the end of the 15th century it had started to shrink, having only 4 houses by 1596. Incredibly, some of the streets survive to this day as sunken straight tracks between earth banks which used to be boundaries of residential property, possibly going as far back as the Domesday Book. Historical sites like these are remarkably rare, but thanks to Norfolk's unique history, these sites are actually fairly common locally, as almost every one out of the 100 or more medieval church ruins would have been a social centre for some kind of domestic settlement. Godwick is much the same, featuring the remains of a church tower amongst the lumps and bumps of the ghost village. Despite what you see, the original church tower actually collapsed by the end of the 16th century, having been abandoned long before this due to the decline of the village's population and subsequent neglect of the church over the past century. In the last quarter of the 16th century, Sir Edward Coke became the owner of the land that Godwick Church sat upon, and while building his country hall, which survived until 1962, he also partially rebuilt the church tower, serving as a romantic folly, as was all the rage during this time. Sir Coke was also responsible for the construction of a large barn which continues to be in use today, however now as a wedding venue rather than to store grain or livestock. Unlike many other church ruins featured in this video, the Folly of All Saints survived generally intact right up until the 1970s, where the gradual falling of masonry was beginning to take its toll on the integrity of the structure. This proved evident as the east face of the tower finally collapsed in a storm in the winter of 1981, leaving the remnants of the church as we see it today. Not much remains of this lonely ruin. However, it deserves a place in this collection for one reason alone: the aesthetic. You can drive past this field 100 times and never even know a church stands just within the tree line. Or perhaps you can gaze over and notice a solitary tower peeking above the canopy of leaves. This is not just a church. This is what inspires great stories and fairy tales. Princesses trapped in towers hugged in ivy, armoured knights on horseback standing at the foot of the stone structures, calling up to the damsel. For me, St Mary Church at Filby encapsulates this perfectly, and serves as a beautiful reminder that a fairy tale adventure is just an imagination away, no matter where you are. This church tower provides a helpful kickstart to get your imagination going. The actual history of St Mary is somewhat domestic. A classic example of a Norman church, adapted in the 13th century with the construction of an octagonal bell stage, gradually falling into disrepair after the medieval period, with the local population finding themselves with the funds to only repair one of the two neighbouring churches, with the Church of St Margaret receiving this much-needed reconstruction in the 1870s, leaving St Mary to gradually fall apart. Norfolk is known for its many tiny hamlets sprinkled across the great countryside. Indeed, you could pass some of these villages without even knowing that anything existed down the roads. Kirby Bicton, Surlingham and Whitlingham all serve as a reminder that sometimes a bit of curiosity is good for the soul. These are all small villages which consist of only a few houses each, yet many hamlets like these still sometimes have two or more medieval churches serving as neighbours to each other. As you are now aware from our previous featured churches, this could be a telltale sign that these hamlets were much bigger settlements during the medieval period than they are today. For Kirby Bicton, a beautiful 12th century tower affixed to a slightly earlier chapel, with some remnants of a 15th century bell stage, most of which has now fallen into a pile of flint rubble at the base of the tower due to storms gradually crumbling the church tower over time. Surlingham Chapel was never a large church, and from what we know, only ever had a bell cote, not a fully fledged belfry tower like the other churches feature. As for Whitlingham Church, it is known that the tower survived right up until the Victorian period, being written about as a romantic and secluded location for young lovers. Unfortunately, a storm brought down the ruinous tower, and over the years the church gradually fell over the side of the hill piece by piece. All that survives today is one section of wall and a large stack of rubble. Not much can be said about these ruins that haven't already been covered. However, if you are a rambler or a keen cyclist, you may want to add these to a route, as Surlingham Chapel, Whitlingham Church and Kirby Bicton are all close to one another. You might also want to include one other particularly interesting ruin which is in the immediate area. I have already made a video dedicated to the church at Bixley, which again I will leave in the description below and I urge you to watch. So for the purpose of this video, I'll simply breeze over the church's highlights. The church at Bixley is dedicated to Saint Wandrosilius. the only surviving church in the country known to be dedicated to this saint. Another classic example of a parish church whose village had all but disappeared. Earthworks of various medieval and Tudor houses can still sometimes be visible in the nearby fields. Furthermore, the church was rebuilt several times over the centuries until it was burnt to the ground in an arson attack in May 2004, with its charred timbers still in place 15 years later when I first visited. One notable update from my previous video is that the church is no longer accessible as it has been purchased and is scheduled to be developed into a domestic house, a project which I look forward to seeing completed in the future. During my many travels to historic sites around Britain, I often come across something unique and characterful. No more is this true than at St Theobald's Church, which sits on the cusp of Coltishall. As a lover of all things Gothic, I was pleasantly surprised to stumble upon the Mortuary chapel which previously acted as the church chancel. Even more surprised upon realising that the padlock securing the gate to the Mortuary chapel was indeed not actually locked. St Theobald serves as a classic example of a particularly rich and impressionable family using local churches as ancestral mausoleums, as upon reading the names on the many gravestones, tombs, and rather fanciful columns, you'll notice the reappearance of a familiar surname. This church actually stands on raised ground and is suggested to have once been an ancient site, although these secrets may never be revealed as Norfolk simply has too many sites of archaeological intrigue to focus on a humble church site as this. Sharing a courtyard with its sister church, St Margaret's of Antingham stands today as a ruin. Typically, two churches in such close proximity is a very rare sight in England. However, as you'll grow to understand, Norfolk is no typical county, and indeed multiple churches sharing a courtyard is a curiously common occurrence. If you'd like to know more about why this is so common in Norfolk, I have a dedicated video discussing this, featuring the medieval village of Reetham, which I'll link in the description below. By the 18th century, both churches were in much need of repair. However, only St Mary's Church received the love and care that it needed, leaving the Church of St Margaret's to slowly fall apart, degrading into an ivy-covered shell which you see today. Despite most people considering Bowthorpe to just be an extension of Norwich, this development only took place in the 1970s, and before that Bowthorpe stood as its own independent village. During the medieval period, Bowthorpe was a much bigger settlement, which unfortunately shrank in size after the Middle Ages, until almost losing its population entirely by the 18th century. A running theme here will be that Norfolk's darkest days were during the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th century, a subject I touch upon in my video about another once major historic site in East Anglia, the coastal city of Dunwich. Again, I'll link this video in the description below. The ruins you see here may have become a barn in the later 16th century, with some repairs done in the 1600s. The church used to have a round tower, which was said to be used as an oven at one point in its history. A rather gruesome tale says that a skeleton was once found sealed within the oven of the tower. Here is a bit of a different type of church ruin. Since this technically isn't a church ruin, however, this further carries the tale of Norfolk's heyday and how it's been long forgotten. This grand Gothic-style church is a beautiful example of how much money Norfolk poured into its many religious sites, yet also serves as a key insight into how Norfolk's big appetite for architectural splendour was severed in its strongest hour. What you see here is a skeleton of the south transept at Clay next to the sea, a never finished addition to the church. All was constructed except the roof and the glass just before the Black Death cast Norfolk into a dark turmoil. After this, either a loss of expertise to complete the works or a lack of financing meant that the south transept remained as a skeleton, a haunting reminder of a fractured dream of religious prosperity. Despite previously admitting to enjoying Gothic things, I must admit that exploring this site did give me a shock, as I quickly found out that the Belfry Tower is home to a considerable flock of crows, or should I say, a murder, who, as I quickly came to realise, could be startled into a sudden flight with a single misplaced footstep. The church tower looks fairly squat considering its wide base. However, what we see today is just the remains of a tower standing at roughly 2/3 of its original height. Edmir was previously thought to have been a sizable settlement up until the 15th century. However, the lay subsidy roll in 1524 reported the village to have just 3 taxpayers. St Edmund's of Edmir remains as a trophy church of medieval Norfolk. The building was continued to be worked upon and expanded despite the village disappearing. It has long been thought that the religious sector of Norfolk embarked on giant church-building projects to show its dedication to the greater glory of God, rather than building churches strictly for congregational worship. As such, Edmir served as exactly this, a dedication to God, under the protection and patronage of the nearby monastic heavyweight Walsingham Abbey. If you are driving through the countryside near Acle, you may spot 3 jaw-droppingly beautiful landmarks. The mooring area next to the gruesomely haunted Acle Bridge, the various stunning ruined windmills, a medieval tower peeking through a crop of trees. This is the church tower of All Saints in Billockby. The tower bears a sizable scar, an open crack caused by a lightning strike in 1762, which condemned the church for over 200 years. The nave was left to ruin, and the chancel was restored in 1872, where it survives today as the only part of the church suitable for congregation. Rather romantically, today you are able to attend congregation by the key holder of the church unlocking the restored porch, then walk through the ghostly ruins of the nave to reach the thatch-roofed chancel. If you're writing a Victorian Jack the Ripper-inspired novel, and you want to breathe in some inspiration for a spooky yet realistic practice of Victorian funeral preparations, then you may value a trip to the church tower of Hanford. Not much can be said about All Saints at Hanford which hasn't already been said about the other churches we have previously visited. It is an old medieval parish church that gradually became abandoned after the Reformation, left to fall into ruin over centuries of neglect. Although Hanford has something in common with one other notable church we have already seen today, namely St Theobald's near Coltishall. Indeed, a short journey from St Theobald's, All Saints at Hanford features a Victorian mortuary chapel. However, this mortuary chapel in particular hits a little different, as it is attached to the medieval tower via the old nave arch, both the chapel and the tower being a storage facility for fresh cadavers, to rest until the day of the funeral. Since the area of Old Hanford had already been long abandoned by the Victorian period, one could conjure up images of gravediggers on horseback, carting along recently deceased corpses over the lonely Norfolk countryside roads shrouded in mist and fog. Arriving at this medieval tower standing like a Gothic beacon in the night, faintly seeing the stone gargoyles through the dimly lit night, the distant sound of shoveling earth as the grave is dug, ready for tomorrow's funeral, all while the dead wait patiently inside the small, cramped mortuary chapel. When learning about the history of Norfolk, and its unfortunate downfall after the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century, the Reformation, the silting up of the trading ports along the coast, and the Industrial Revolution, it's easy to forget the horror of the bombing raids during World War II. On the night of Monday, the 27th of April 1942, Norwich was subjected to its darkest day of the entire war. The hum of the Luftwaffe war engines began to fill the sky and made the people of Norwich rise from their beds. The bomb bay doors opened and the city of Norwich was set ablaze. Of the 340 Norwich citizens killed during the bombing of World War II, around half of them died on this single night. Almost every medieval stained glass window in Norwich was shattered, covering the city streets as jagged crystals amongst the charred timbers, roaring fires, and blown apart brickwork, all hidden under a thick fog of dust and concrete. St Bartholomew's Church at Ham was amongst the first churches in Norwich to fall victim to the German bombing. A holy site which had stood for almost 1,000 years now lay torn apart in a debris-strewn courtyard in Norwich. A few other churches were subjected to the same unfortunate destiny as this one, such as St Paul's, St Michael's, and St Benedict's, all blown apart by the bombs that fell, and were subsequently demolished in the decade that followed. Today, St Bartholomew survives as a reminder of Norwich's dealings with the Luftwaffe during World War II, with the tower and the layout of the church being a visible scar of the city's history. Thank you for watching my video about some of the church ruins which best tell the story of Norfolk's rich history, and be sure to look out for my future videos about more of Norfolk's churches, as there are so many to show and so much to talk about. But for now, thanks for watching.